So I just had a wonderful discussion here with my friend about needing to find a balance between the practical and the poetry in our lives. The practical is doing your homework. The practical is fetching water and chopping wood. The practical is meeting your responsibilities. But the poetry is singing your song. The poetry is marching to the beat of your own drummer. You know, the poetry is the thing that lights you up. The poetry is your intuition, your love of flow and adventure. In other words, your poetry is often the impractical. And so we're told to meet deadlines and to meet our responsibilities. And I understand this messaging, but I think that often this messaging tells us that our poetry is fundamentally impractical and that we should choose the practical. Potentially in more spiritual circles, we are encouraged to pay attention to the poetry as well. We are told to find a balance between the practical and the poetry, to meet each halfway, and so on and so forth. And that very may well be true, that we might find a way to be both practical and poetry. But sometimes the answer is paradoxical. Sometimes the most practical thing we can do, sometimes the most practical thing we need is actually something that's not practical at all. Now that sounds like an oxymoron, it sounds like a paradox, that sometimes the most practical intervention, the thing you need the most, practically speaking, for your mental health, is to do the impractical thing, is to do the poetic thing only, to take the leap. As Terence McKenna said, nature loves courage. You make the commitment, and nature responds to that commitment by removing impossible obstacles. This is where it gets metaphysical. You dream the impossible dream, the impractical dream, and the world will not grind you under, it will lift you up. This is, they say, the secret. What all the philosophers, the teachers, the wise men, the shamans, those who really touched the alchemical gold, those who really understood, this is what they understood. This is how magic is done. This is the shamanic dance in the waterfall. You leap into the abyss, you hurl yourself into the abyss, and you realize that it's a feather bed. And so how can this be? How can sometimes the most practical thing be the poetry, be the impractical thing? Well, it's like that scene in the movie Eat, Pray, Love, when the main character, Elizabeth Gilbert, played by Julia Roberts, has broken up with her new love, and she's telling her shaman that she ended it. And then he says, "Why you do that, Liz? Why you do that? Why you end your relationship?" And she says, "I lost my balance." Right? It just wasn't practical. You know, she had her yoga, she had her breath work, she had her journaling, she had her meditation. She spent this whole year finding balance, and then she falls in love with this guy, and she loses her balance completely in the throngs of love. And so now she ends it. Because why? Because it's not practical. And you know what the shaman says? Liz, sometimes losing balance for love is part of living a balanced life. And so to that end, sometimes losing your shit for poetry, sometimes losing your practical for poetry is exactly the practical thing to do, and it's what you need in living a practical life. That sometimes becoming poetry is necessary for a practical and a healthy life. And I thought that was really interesting because it resolves the paradox the moment you realize that. It's reconciliatory. It's when thesis and antithesis are resolved by synthesis. That sometimes the most practical thing is the most impractical and most poetic thing, after all. Sometimes losing balance for love is part of living a balanced life. So there you go.